Um, so Happy New Year, everyone. Here we go again. Wonderful to see you all. As I appreciate, there might be some new people on the call, but I suspect looking at down the list of names, many of you all know what this is about. But just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Lovely to see you all. My name is Oliver Hurry. I chair the Scope 3 peer group. So the Scope 3 peer group is now quite an extraordinary number of people globally, all focused on the challenge of supply chain decarbonisation. And really, what we want to do is ultimately make it easier for people to make faster, more confident decisions and action on Scope 3 by learning from other individuals who are going through the same challenges, the same issues, scratching their head in the same place about this incredibly difficult thing to do. We're very, very focused on helping the individual, not companies. Too many initiatives in the world focused on helping logos rather than the people who are actually tasked with doing the work. So that's what we're very much about. To cope with the sheer number of things that the Scope 3 Group wants to tackle, and to really bring in the ultimate expertise, there's absolutely no way that me and my colleague Rona, and that's really who we are running the Scope 3 Group, can do this all alone. So it's about partnering with friends who are really doing fantastic work. And the RMI team, I've known RMI many, many years, and it's great to be been working with the wonderful team at RMI more recently. So the reason why we're looking at this is that ultimately we know that procurement and the sourcing of low carbon solutions and materials is critical to our achievement of our scope 3. In our map of activity that we're planning, this fits very much in the actual decarbonisation of both suppliers and, in this case, supply. So we really see this as one of the key challenges that the peer group wants to face. So when the RMI came to me and said that they wanted to run a series of meetings and organise them and run them for me with me, I was happily accepting that offer, and they've done an amazing job. So I'm sure you'll get a follow up with all the previous sessions if you've not seen them. They do all stick sort of join together, but they're also individually fantastic as well. So I'll hand over to my colleague Hal and team today to take you through what we're talking about today. But please do ask questions. Get stuck in. We demand it. This is not a webinar in that you can't ask questions. Everyone's got a voice in here. I'll facilitate. Please put your questions in the chat, but don't be afraid to put your hand up at any point. Hal, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ollie. Always a pleasure to collaborate, and I always love the way that you kick off the webinar. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Hao. I'm a manager with RMI. We are a nonprofit organization that focuses on global clean energy transition. On the scope 3 topic, we focus on improving emission transparency through sector-specific carbon accounting, and also advancing the low carbon procurement strategies and mechanisms that drive the real sectoral decarbonization. And that's why we have the webinar series, as Ali said. And today we're going to deep dive into the most exciting / complicated chemical sector. Before we dive in, let's do a quick warm up as usual. On the next slide, you can see that we have a quick question. So on the scale of 1 to 3, how comfortable or confident you feel with procuring low carbon chemicals? Number 1 means new to me. Number 3 means familiar, and I've already had some practices. We want to assess the general familiarity on this topic, and it will be really beneficial for us as we tailor the presentation as we go. Okay, I see numbers popping up in the range
Already someone doing a
between 1 to 2.
1.5. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I see a few 3. So would love to hear the practices later on from those 3. And I see a lot of answers are between 1 to 2. And we will keep that in mind as we go through the slides for sure. Thanks so much. And on the next slide, just a quick housekeeping. Please stay muted during the presentation. And as always, please post any questions in the chat, and we will address them live where possible or respond in the chat in order. And also on next slide to remind everyone that this webinar series is based on our low carbon procurement guide, which you will be able to access via the QR code. It is a step-by-step guidance that covers topics from internal momentum implementation with sector-specific insights. And you will be able to see more information about the previous webinars as well. So on the next page, I'm excited to say that I'm joined by a group of experts from the team, Joe, Tania, Anisha, and Sharon. They will walk you through the following topics. We'll start with the chemical sector accounting and insurance overview, which is a fundamental piece for product differentiation. And then we will provide some case examples of how we're working with GMA, Center for Green Market Activation, to apply market-based mechanisms, book and claim, to the low emission chemicals and fertilizer procurement. Towards the end, we will share some publicly available tools to help buyers inform their purchasing decision. And throughout, we will also invite a few industry experts to share their views on those topics as well. So let's dive in. I'm going to pass the floor to Joe. Over to you.
Thank you, Hal. I'm Joe Warren, and I'll be your first technical guide on this chemical sector deep dive. As Hal said, we'll start with accounting and assurance systems, specifically why they are needed, and a summary landscape of some of the existing best practices out there. Next slide. So you may have heard that chemicals are the industry of industries because they are truly in every single physical product, filling the gaps of other industrial products. The current supply chain for them can generate anywhere from 3 to 10% of global emissions, depending on the boundaries you select. And unfortunately, there's no clear single emissions reduction technology, and the emissions tend to be distributed quite evenly across the supply chain. Even looking at some of the more intensive heavy industry primary chemicals like olefins, ammonia, and methanol, in the US, you could see in this graphic, we estimate nearly 40% of embodied emissions occur upstream of the chemical plant. And the remaining emissions are relatively evenly split between energy use of combustion and direct process emissions from the chemical sector. Next slide. We've also done an analysis of the US primary chemical market and really show that there's two tracks needed to address all emissions in parallel. About half of emissions can be addressed today using cleaner production and alternative pathways. And here, this is where standards in accounting is really essential to accelerate deployment of these and get that first half of easy wins. Assurance systems overall are really needed to support the deployment of new processes and products as well as accelerate current cuts. And at this point, we'll shift into an example of one of these current solutions that can be enabled by better assurance systems. Next slide. So a lot of people focus on alternative feedstocks for chemicals, bio-based or recycled, but there is also no standard unit of energy or joule of oil and gas. So the latest independent data show that emissions to supply these fossil fuels and chemical feedstocks are higher than previously assumed. You can see the dotted line is kind of the EPA assumption on the left side graph. And they also vary significantly, up to a factor of 10 between the cleanest and the most emitting. And on the right, most graphic, you could see that most of these differences are driven by methane gas leaks. And instead of leaking this gas, it could be sold as valuable natural gas feedstock for primary chemicals, while also simultaneously lowering embodied emissions by more than 10%. So an assurance system for low leak gas that's independent can really incentivize this near-term and necessary win-win. And at this point, I'll transition to my colleague Tania here to go through a summary landscape of the accounting and assurance systems out there.
Thanks, Joe. So this slide kind of gives an overview of all the standards and methodologies that are relevant to the chemical sector. And starting at the bottom, all of these standards and methodologies are built on norms set by the ISO standards and Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard. And then moving up, there's a couple of options for chemical PCF accounting methodologies. And then in blue over here, we have additional certification standards that are available for anything from feedstocks to chemical plants to end products. And in section 2, we're going to cover ammonia fertilizers and ethylene example applications of some of these standards. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this slide gives a kind of zoom in on some of these sustainability frameworks and the coverage that they have. So in the table over here is the standard and methodology, and the voluntary third-party standards provide a range of coverage for product types, their greenhouse gas impacts, and then also their non-GHG impacts. And then among the available standards, there's their variability in their granularity, auditing procedures, compatibility, and then also their approach to attribution, chain of custody, and baselining. So from here, you can see that kind of a combination of standards can adequately account for the entire supply chain. Okay, and then here we have an example of how a combination of assurance systems can be used to address the entire life cycle of the product and different market needs. So in the middle is the base calculation methodology. So you typically would use together for sustainability guidelines for that, just to do a PCF calculation that you can compare across products. And then you can use different third-party standards for your certified inputs. So for example, biofeeds or fossil fuel feeds for independent quality assurance and also additional track and tracing capabilities. And then you also can use third-party certification standards and claims for to certify your PCFs, and then also to allow for asset level reduction claims to customers, for example. And then I'll pass it back to Hal for the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Joe and Tania. We do have an expert that Liam from Univar Solution, but also representing TFS today. We would love to hear from you. What's your thinking around the trend of accounting and insurance space? And how do you see this will be able to actually support green procurement? And if you see any gaps exist, welcome your thoughts.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So I'm Liam McCarroll. I'm the Senior Director of Global Sustainability at Univar Solutions, and many of you might not have heard of us, but we are one of the world's leading chemical and ingredient distributors. So what does that mean? Well, we connect some of the world's largest and smallest producers of all sorts of chemicals and ingredients products with customers at the right size and at the right place for the customer. So it is increasingly important that we get it right when it comes to product carbon footprinting. And whilst I'm representing Univar Solutions, I'm also at the same time representing Together for Sustainability. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Together for Sustainability is an industry initiative within the chemical industry that's really member-led and sort of striving towards increasing sustainability, transparency, accountability within the chemical supply chain. So it's a perfect, perfect opportunity to talk about PCF certifications and standards, because there really is no common, no one size fits all approach, if you like. I think it was Tanya was just walking through the different levels that we have. I'm going to get into some of that and where TFS sits on it, from the ISO standards to TFS's own guidelines all the way up to ISCC plus. And the reality is, when we have hundreds or thousands of customers and we have hundreds of thousands of suppliers, not everyone's speaking the same language on it. And that's really where TFS comes in, because they have released and produced, and now it's on its third version, the TFS PCF guidance. And it's very similar and actually fully aligned with the PACT methodology on this. It is fully aligned with the GHG protocol for product standards, and it's fully aligned with ISO 14067, because of course there are commonalities. But what this standard allows is, the breadth, we can take in the breadth of the chemical industry so it can be applicable, but it also brings the granularity that we get with ISO 14067. And you know what, it's incredibly helpful when we're trying to connect customers who have increasing expectations on PCFs with suppliers who are increasingly trying to work to evidence their is that to me, Oliver, or to everybody? Oh, sorry. We're trying to connect suppliers with customers and the customers with suppliers, and trying to speak the same language is incredibly helpful. So do we all need to be looking and using the same standard? No, we don't. Is it helpful sometimes when there are industry standards? Absolutely. And for any of you who are interested to learn a little more, all of this is publicly available information. You can go and have a look on the TFS website and get a feel for their guidance and the guidelines that they have set. Through TFS, we're trying to broaden the use of that so that we are increasingly speaking the same language. And I mean, it's important. These standards bring credibility, they bring consistency. I will talk about some of the gaps because they're not perfect. But increasingly through this cross-industry collaboration, we're seeing more and more of our suppliers and customers be able to exchange information more easily because we're all working or singing from the same hymn sheet, if you like. But when it comes to terminology, I want to make one little point, which is we've got the standards and we have the guidelines from organizations like PACT and TFS. It's separate from certifications and verifications, right? So we have certifications like ISCC Plus. You might have Red Cert. Others are available right now. I'm not advocating for any particular one. And they will require an organization to be able to identify that they're operating in line with the certification standards. That, again, is separate to an organization going out and saying, okay, well, I want to align with TFS's guidelines, but I want somebody else to prove that I'm doing it. And that's where you would go to an external verification body. And that's something that we're looking at. I think it's a powerful message to say that not only do we say that we're operating in line with these guidelines, but a third party has validated that we are operating in line with those guidelines. And I think that's, I'm not going to say rare, but it's something that's increasingly interesting for us and many of our customers who want the additional confidence in the product carbon footprints that are being created, because much like not all chemicals are created equal, Tanya's slide before last had the example of, I think it was hexane or something similar, where you would have, varying product carbon footprints associated with the same material depending on how it's being produced. PCFs are similar in that sense. There are so many variables that you could have the same product produced the same way, but you would have some showing much lower than others depending on boundaries, etc. And that's where I'll come into some of the limitations as I see it, is where we are, the gaps that we have. The biggest one being that despite these standards, it is difficult, and actually TFS advises against using PCFs from their guidelines to say you can make a more sustainable choice here. So the guidelines have such flexibility and boundaries, and estimations are allowed to the point that you can't have a perfect apples with apples comparison. And so then you can't say, well, supplier A's product is lower emissions than supplier B's in a kind of objective sense, because you're not really comparing like for like. So to do that, do many of these standards help us? Not really. I think you have to go for a very transparent full life cycle assessment, 14,044 externally verified, to get to the point where you can have certainty. But it certainly can be helpful for your customers in calculating their scope 3 emissions, and it can help give you some indicative feelings of if we're heading in the right direction for sustainable sourcing. That's the biggest problem, in my opinion, right? It's useful, but it's useful to a limitation. As long as we understand that and we can work to fill in those gaps, that's a good starting point. And my second bugbear, and this is not on behalf of TFS, right? This is my opinion, is that we all have to be very careful. We're working towards increasing primary data. That's what we want out of a PCF. We want it to be from the supplier, and the supplier to have had primary information from their suppliers, etc. But we should be careful not to get carried away when we get a supplier PCF, because the chances are there's a good degree of secondary information within that. And so your organizations might see that when you go from a secondary PCF, let's say the product carbon footprint for a ton of material was 3 TCO2e, and then you get a primary and it says, well, actually it's 2.7. You say, great, we've come down 0.3. Well, actually, they might that supplier might have used a lot of secondary data, and if they then go to their supplier and get primary data on the extraction of the raw material, it might jump up to 4. And so there's a risk of inaccuracies all along the way. And just because a PCF is primary doesn't mean that it's entirely primary. We should be cautious and not scared off by it, but aware that change can continue to occur as we get more accurate over time. And maybe if I could probably go on a long time with limitations, because I can talk about differences in biogenic emissions and how do we incentivize the sourcing and production of bio-based products and seeing the benefits of it. We could talk about the ability to share en masse through digital tools, PCFs, and the standardization of that process. But maybe I'll leave with one more challenge that I think we all should be aware of and we can work towards, which is that a lot of the time this just isn't available. So we ourselves, if I think about Univar Solutions, we might get a request from a customer. Hey, we've got 10 products we want PCFs for. And we say, okay, well, for 2 of them, we have primary data. And again, that's primary because some of that might still be secondary. But the rest, we have to look elsewhere. And for 8 out of 10 products, and maybe I'm being pessimistic there, but for 8 out of 10 products, we might have to look at third-party databases, for example, EcoInvent, to get some of that data, right, for the feedstock. And then we add Univar Solutions operational emissions to it to create a cradle to gate. What I would say is the gap there is the supplier's engagement and the suppliers being able to produce those PCFs. If there's a message to leave with, it is the importance of supplier engagement and collaboration to bring folks on the journey, because otherwise we will be continuously improving secondary data and not really getting any more accurate along the way and not actually being able to track if your broader scope 3 reduction plans are having any impact. That's the fact of it. You'll think it looks good, the numbers won't reflect it because we're continuing to rely on secondary data. So I'll probably shut up for a minute. If there are any questions, happily welcome them, or you can send them after the event, of course. Happy to collaborate with Hal to get you those answers as well.
Thank you so much, Liam. Really like the way, all the great work that TFS has been doing on the PCF, product carbon footprint, and also you being very honest about its limitations. And a lot of work still has to be done for us to get to the point of apple-to-apple comparison and the primary data. And I know that TFS also done great work in guiding the supplier engagement. So I appreciate your thoughts. We don't have too much time for Q&A, just maybe one question. I think this is an interesting one. Would love to hear both Liam and maybe Joe. Do you find demand for LCA harmonization from your work with your clients? I guess here Jonathan is referring to like the downstream customers, right? Do we see more and more ask coming? Maybe just like one sentence, if you could be brief so that we can keep this moving.
I could go quickly.
Jump in. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm also happy to jump in and add any detail to the question if it's helpful for Joe and crew, but you guys go for it.
I'd say generally yes, depending on the space you're looking at, and it just kind of depends on where you are in the PCF primary data maturity journey that Liam was addressing.
I generally agree. There is a journey that a lot of customers will go on. Those who are at the beginning of the journey aren't necessarily asking us to comply or provide PCFs within a certain standard or have external verification. But those that are further along in the journey will be more keen to see harmonization and see the PCFs that they see the greatest value in. So it really depends on the customer, and part of our job is meeting them on that journey where they are and bringing them along.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Yeah, it's definitely been something we've seen a lot of in the food space. And then it's that really delicate balance, which I loved how you spoke about of, we want to encourage all these primary data points to come through and people to get enthusiastic and bring that in. But equally, you need to be comparing like for like. So we've also kind of got to be the stewards of that comparison being feasible.
Thank you, Jonathan. Excellent question. Now we're moving to the procurement mechanisms. We won't stop just at the data pieces. So how do we, practically speaking, procure from upstream and support the demand for low carbon chemicals? I'm going to hand it over to Anisha.
Thanks, Hao. Hi, everyone. In this section, we'll be talking about the emissions challenge in generally the high value chemicals and fertilizer sectors and how we're building a green procurement mechanism to really catalyze the supply and demand for low emission products. So, this is part of a collaboration between RMI and the Center for Green Market Activation, that's GMA. So, for some context, the chemical production, like Joe said earlier, drives over around 6% of global emissions today, and it's increasing. So, out of this, high value chemicals like olefins and aromatics, along with ammonia, account for over 70% of these chemical emissions. On the other hand, corporate purchasers from FMCGs to packaging to food and beverage companies have made a lot of meaningful Scope 3 commitments and are actively seeking approaches to meet these commitments. But on the supply side, when decarbonization projects are being produced, there's a mismatch or sometimes a lack of visibility on how much committed demand is there to really reach final investment decisions and scale these technologies, which are often very capital intensive. So that complexity of the middle of the supply chain sometimes inhibits an effective transfer of cost and value when a low emission product is made. So, to bridge this gap, we are building a credible, traceable system that I'll walk you through more in the coming slides. So, here we can see on the left in the chart, which shows if you look at baseline emissions in 2050 and what sort of levers can help reduce that, we can see that circularity levers are going to be key to achieving a lot of 2050 goals, but they're not sufficient alone. They'll need to be complemented with decarbonizing a lot of the virgin plastic that's still going to be made, which could easily account for 40 to 50% of all plastics, even in a best case circular economy. So, along with waste elimination, product reuse, and material recycling, um, the virgin plastic emissions are still expected to be there because there's limited availability of recycled feedstocks. There are some regulatory restrictions in some sectors where virgin materials are still needed, like in healthcare or food and pharma. And in some cases, plastics offer unique functional benefits that are also unable to be met with other materials. So, this entire piece of virgin production that still needs to be decarbonized can happen when primary chemical suppliers are able to uh, make investments in these large scale technologies that can bring the primary chemical production down. And to help do this, we are building a book and claim system where where the upstream chemical suppliers are directly able to communicate with the corporate buyers of these chemicals. The engagement that such a system can foster is that, and the fact that there are so many market barriers that it can address makes it something really attractive to explore in a sector that's historically looked at direct procurement approaches. Today, there's limited visibility across a very long, complex supply chain that chemicals is. There's uncertainty in demand signals. And like my colleague said, a lack of harmonization across accounting guidance. Um, and so many times the buyers and suppliers are just located all over the world, which creates a geographic fragmentation between them. So to tackle all of this, book and claim allows direct engagement between the two ends of the value chain. And we can do that because the system really disaggregates the emissions attribute from the physical delivery of the product. So you can see on the left half of the supply chain where ethylene, propylene, and other chemicals are made, they go through the entire conversion to end products and only then reach the buyer of the chemicals. But when there are EACs, the primary chemical producer is able to issue those, and your chemical buyers are able to claim those EACs, which are environmental attribute certificates, and still meet the ambitious Scope 3 commitments that are in place. Um, over Overall, this is how we're planning to build a system for decarbonizing the complex chemical sector. And I'll pass it to my colleague Sharan to walk you through a case study on the fertilizer side.
Thank you, Anisha. Let me give you a lay of the land on what's happening in the fertilizer sector. Over the past few years, we've seen increasing and more ambitious commitments from food and beverage companies, specifically related to Scope 3. This is particularly important because for food and beverage companies, Scope 3 represent almost 90% of emissions. And among the suite of interventions that are needed, fertilizer production is the most quantifiable, provable, and addressable. And this is specifically important because some of these companies have 2030 targets. I'll unpack that later, but what I mean by fertilizer production is specifically nitrogenous fertilizer products whose foundational building block is ammonia. So we've seen some early movers in the sectors, some initial agreements and MOUs. Some of these examples are in Europe, where we've seen PepsiCo and Yara agreeing on 165 kilotons of nitrates. And in the US, we'll also see some movement related to green ammonia between CF Industries and POET, but also pretty large blue and green ammonia deals have been made. Most recently, Uniper has agreed to purchase a substantial amount of green ammonia from India. So there is increasing movement, and also mandates and policies are helping driving to that. Next slide. Let me focus right now on ammonia and its cost. While this is a high capex investment upstream for fertilizer producers, when we think about the entire value chain and the foodstuff product, actually the additional production cost is not that much, right? We're talking about around 1% increase in the price of the product, as well as some significant emission reductions, depending on the product. Of course, wheat has a higher nitrogen intensity when it comes to a kilo of product, and that's why bread appears as a product where ammonia emissions can be reduced the most, but this is a subset of how this would look like in some of the most common products. Next slide. So thinking about fertilizer production, this is not the only solution, right? But it is the most ready. arguably fertilizer application and soil management are one of the most, if not the most important suite of interventions that will have to be will be needed to decarbonize the agriculture sector. But these require scale, behavioral change, and the effectiveness can be varied depending on a variety of elements. When it comes to fertilizer application, soil conditions, weather, crops are very difficult to measure. Same with the soil health, right? Variable benefits, difficult to measure, while instead fertilizer production can be done now. These are very established technology pathways. Haber-Bosch has been around for over 100 years. Alkaline electrolyzer have been around for decades. This is a drop-in replacement. This is essentially the same product. And this is a considerable size of the emissions, right? This is 2% of global emissions, and any action, any early mover would be seen as climate leader that would then catalyze industry-wide decarbonization. Taking as an example, urea, the most common fertilizer product, just by decarbonizing hydrogen and ammonia, we can eliminate around 87% of emissions from well to gate with no farm level changes required. And the added benefit is that, of course, industrial clean facilities can issue credits to the point that Anisha was making and have, for food and beverage companies, reportable Scope 3 claims. But let's go on to the next slide. Because while we have a solution, the main challenge is for producers to have bankable demand signals to then make these investments in low carbon fertilizers, right? So that is the main issue and challenge. On the consumption side, the other challenge is consumers can't access these upstream emissions and can't have a direct access to fertilizer producers because of the complex value chain, especially the middle of the value chain is quite complex and obscures these demand signals. And so there is demand uncertainty on the very top of the supply chain. That's why we're working on a book and claim mechanism that will help companies to make investments in low carbon fertilizer products. The product will flow into the value chain as the physical product would flow into the value chain as always, but the environmental attributes of the product would then be sold to the consumption companies, and the consumption companies will pay the premium to the producer. And so that will help catalyze the market, help bring down cost, and eventually get it to scale, right? We've seen that in the electricity market. That's what we're seeing best with GMA and RMI. We've done that also through the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance. We're now doing that both in chemicals and fertilizer. Now over to you, Anisha, to close this.
Thank you, Sharon. So leading up to everything that we introduced with book and claim for chemicals and fertilizers, we are basically building this pilot system now to enable transactions for both of these subsectors and test out how book and claim can help transform procurement. We've had experience in doing this with other sectors like aviation, maritime shipping, steel, cement and concrete, and trucking. And it has shown that market-based demand-side mechanisms are powerful levers of change. So right now, we are in the process of recruiting companies who procure both ethylene and fertilizers to participate in our pilot procurement and really co-build the system with us. The current focus is on fertilizers and ethylene. For For this pilot, we're targeting to facilitate pilot offtakes that can demonstrate proof of concept for the system and really build a framework that's um, transparent, robust, and auditable, and accounts for all the principles that are out there in the market. We will soon be launching an RFI, a request for information, to profile the breadth of available solutions for fertilizers. Similarly, later in March, we will also be launching an RFP, a request for proposal, to along with the aggregated demand for ethylene, and invite suppliers to respond to it. So just to wrap us up, the goal really here is to build a robust system that's built on integrity and transparency, and which aligns with the leading GHG accounting frameworks out there. We want to ensure that there's consistency by leveraging a standardized process. We want to ensure that there's integrity by setting emission reduction thresholds that can be audited by third parties so that these EACs are foolproof and can prevent double counting, and will be maintained through public registries so that the whole system remains transparent. And seeing a lot of questions also on the chat about how this works out with all the accounting systems out there. So we have been leaning on existing credible platforms out there, like the AIM platform, which is a new standard for Scope 3 mechanisms, and also engaging with SBTI and GHG working groups. So the entire system gets built out in a way that's credible, transparent, and robust. You can reach out to us at chemicals@rmi.org to learn more on how you can participate, and we'd be very happy to chat with you. Now I'll hand it back to Hal to walk us through the Q&A for this portion.
Thank you so much, Anisha and Shravan, for the comprehensive overview. I do see there are lots of questions coming, but first we're going to turn to Rob from MCOR. What do you think about market-based mechanisms? Do you think they're effective, and how this may help you? I saw people asking about how do we ensure the credibility and safeguards to make sure that at the end of the day it can generate credible claims. What do you think?
Hi, everyone. Very glad to join you. So just to answer the base question, yes, I do think market-based mechanisms can be effective. From being in the sustainability space for, I won't date myself, but a while, over a decade, I think regulation drives things best. But before you can have regulations, regulators aren't going to create all this stuff from scratch. We need some basic elements, and that's where leading organizations, which I'm assuming if you're on this call, you probably are a leader, or you're wanting to be a leader and just haven't, demonstrated that yet, perhaps. But we need these market-based mechanisms so that leading organizations can, first of all, show that there is demand. Because if, that's one of the most common complaints I have is when you're talking to someone from a supplier and they say, oh, we don't have the demand to do these things. I'm like, what are you talking about? I've been talking to this sustainability person or this procurement person, and now this other person saying we don't have the demand. So we have to demonstrate the demand. And then, unfortunately, there's so many kinks to work out. The primary versus secondary, were upstream methane leaks properly accounted for? Is it certified? What standard are we using? Does this standard agree with this other standard? And quite frankly, we're at the messy point. It is messy. And that's why we need the leaders to lean in and say, hey, I'm going to do this to the best of my ability. And I am going to work with RMI because people like me, I'm very happy to say I'm not the smartest on this call. I love to be on calls where I'm not the smartest. So I have to ask people that know more than me for help. And when we try to do these things, we're going to hear from those experts. The people that, if we did things wrong, are probably also the same people that would be reaching out to let us know we did things wrong. And then when we do these things, we're all going to learn from each other. And that's why it's important to have these webinars, to publish results. Also, shout out to RMI on their plastic conversion guidance that we work with them on has been very helpful in highlighting some of these issues that we do have to overcome. So it's not, I wish I could say it was easy and we just have to do it no, it's difficult, and that's why it's all that more important to do it.
That's really well said. Thank you so much, Rob. And you have been such a great partner for us as well, and really truly appreciate the time and energy dedicated to the sustainability and decarbonization world. Okay, so we do have maybe like 2 minutes to have like one or two, maybe one question. Sorry, I don't want to overpromise. Maybe let's just speak about the credibility issue. I know that Anisha, you've already touched upon it, but could you please just give a few words around how we make sure that we design the system in a way that that is credible, and how we work with stakeholders on this to ensure that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll chime in and would love to hear also from Joe, who is partnering on designing the system. So we recognize that there are so many challenges with chemicals, given how many intermediaries are in between and the various ways that it can be made, and just the fact that there are so many chemical products that exist. So right now, we are focusing our pilot efforts on the chemical ethylene, which is one of the largest building brick of a lot of plastics out there, and exploring how we can integrate a lot of the existing accounting standards to mitigate the challenges that come with how the product flows from the initial phase of production all the way downstream to when it's getting procured. Some of the big ways we're doing this is by setting a emissions reduction threshold that can be that we want to ensure is met by solutions that suppliers are providing, and making sure that there's a credible baseline against which we're measuring so that it prevents loopholes on how things can be accounted. And doing all of this through a completely transparent system that can be audited by an independent third party, so that even when suppliers and buyers are located in different parts of the world, there's a way to make sure that there's no double counting, and that the EACs are being made and retired in the right way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Joe, please add, and you can move forward with your presentation tools as well after you address this.
Sure. Yeah, I think Anisha summed it up well. Just add that getting the right priorities for the transparency metrics, the system interfaces for harmonization, and really piloting in practice to work out the kinks and blind spots are really critical. And happy to move on to the next section. Great. So we had a good conversation about what best practices are out there, and we very clearly went into how do you have the right conversations, how do you fill in the gaps as you work through this messy middle. So going to go over two free public tools that can potentially help through this. Next slide, please. And these are specifically Climate Trace and OCI Plus, or the Oil Climate Index plus gas. So these can check or fill in gaps in current procurement data, reveal differentiation opportunities. And when you are working with your suppliers, you want to have a good starting point for these discussions on what you can practically do to cut emissions. And these can really help facilitate those conversations. On the left, you could see an example visual from Climate Trace, which is every single global steam cracker that produces ethylene and other plastic derivatives with emissions at its height. And on the right is a ranking of oil and gas fields by emissions intensity, which you could find in the Oil Climate Index plus gas tool. Next slide. So going into Trace, it's a coalition of nearly 100 independent organizations to create a global emissions inventory by asset. So this covers over 700 million emitting assets that can be aggregated to a city, state, or country equivalent. You can look at select sector breakdowns by gas and by year going back all the way to 2015. You can even look at monthly data going back to 2021. And several countries, cities, and companies are using this data to fill emissions reporting gaps, check existing supplier reported data, and look for opportunities to cut emissions. This graphic on the right specifically shows the newest emission reduction solution feature, and it can generate pseudo marginal abatement curves for any region or sector or combination of such. So this is an example of chemicals, which we know is daunting, but it could be a helpful starting point for when you talk to your suppliers on where should we start in cutting emissions and improving the landscape. Next slide. Great. And moving on to OCI Plus, this really reveals what those fossil input intensity differences likely are when you're not really sure where to start. Since I mentioned in the beginning, they could be really big in ranges. So if you care about plastics and olefins and aromatics and other derivatives, the tool on the left can really show you what oil and gas fields you may want to avoid, which would be the ones all the way to the right, or prefer all the way to the left, particularly the uh, bottom left in your supply chains. On the right, if you care more about hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, nitrogen fertilizers, and other derivatives, this really shows that it's a helpful starting point to understand what kind of oil and gas field your supply chains are sourcing from. But really, if you're sourcing from wet gas and dry gas, there's a big range of opportunities there, and you could see as a order of magnitude difference. At this point, I'm happy to close things out and turn it back over to Hal.
Thanks so much, Joe. We have one last speaker, Roy from Atmospheric AI. Let me see if he's here. But would love to
Yes, I
hear. Okay, great. How do we translate the data from those public tools to something that could be useful for procurement team?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Roy, CEO and co-founder from Atmospheric AI. We believe that those tools that Joe just presented, Climate Trace and OCI Plus, have done nothing short of groundbreaking for the industry. We believe that once we as an ecosystem recognize that there is no such thing as standard oil when it comes to the carbon intensity, we truly cross a massive threshold of maturity towards action. This 10 times difference in the carbon intensity of a single barrel of oil that Joe pointed out, based on where and how it is extracted, has variability that flows into every chemical and polymer in your supply chain, which means that the average emission factors that are used for compliance purposes are fundamentally inaccurate. They're not a good representation of your exact raw materials that you buy. On an example of high density polyethylene, as only one example, we see 2 times difference in carbon intensity. Again, depends on where it's coming from, what feedstocks, and how it was made, which means companies can, in other words, can reduce up to 50% of their scope 3 emissions simply by choosing a more effective supply chain and feedstock routes, still speaking within the realm of virgin oil feedstocks without even paying more. We believe that we care a lot about renewable feedstocks because we know that they have lower carbon, but when it comes to oil, until those tools make an appearance, we treat everything as the same, and we are very glad to see that new shift in understanding. What is still a critical gap, or the elephant in the room, is that based on a recent McKinsey survey, less than 5% of large manufacturing companies actually have visibility into their supply chain beyond tier 1 and tier 2. So the fact that you can see those emission factors of oil and steam crackers, it is disconnected from your reality, from the raw materials that you actually buy. And this is one of the gaps that we at Atmospheric AI are working to close. in 2 sentences, we have built the first live digital twin of the petrochemical supply chain, helping today some of the world's largest manufacturers trace their raw materials all the way back to oil and model the cost, carbon, and risk along the way so they can make better decisions on their bottom line and the planet. If you're interested to learn more, I'm available through RMI or Oliver, or I'll drop my email. So that's from our side.
Thank you so much, Roy. I think your company will play such an important role to close this gap, and I appreciate everybody who would love to learn more about their work. I think Ollie already shared the link, and please feel free to reach out as well. Next slide. I think that is all for today's content discussion, and this is the last webinar we have in this webinar series, but definitely not the last piece of our work. We're going to continue carry on this work. If you could move the slides, it's not advancing on my screen. Thank you. Please feel free to reach out. You will be able to access the link. We're going to share the slides. You'll be able to access the QR code and link of the procurement guide, which has a lot of insights across different sectors and how to reach out as well. And I would also love to thank Ollie again for the great partnership between RMI and Sculptor Peer Group on this webinar series. And thanks so much, everyone, for your support along the way as well. And we look forward to working with all of you more this year, and hope everyone has a nice 2026. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you, everyone. See you all very soon. Take care. Well done, Hal. Well done, Doris. Well done, team.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
all. Great to see you all.
Thank you.